You've heard the legends: Iron Maidens, racks, thumbscrews, but how much of it was real? What truly went on inside the stone walls of medieval torture chambers? Were these instruments of pain used every day, or were they tools of rare, symbolic cruelty? This isn't just a story of violence, it's a story of fear, power, and how far institutions will go to control the body and the mind. Today, we step behind the dungeon doors, and the truth might disturb you more than the myths. It begins in silence. Stone walls, damp floors, flickering torchlight, none of it mattered as much as what people believed happened behind those locked doors. Torture in the medieval world was never just physical, it was psychological. The mere possibility of being summoned to a chamber of pain was often enough to extract obedience, repentance, or silence. Torture was part of a larger system of control, one shaped by monarchs, bishops, inquisitors, and judges who understood that fear could be more powerful than the blade. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued the papal bull Ad Extirpanda, which authorized the use of torture in cases of heresy. This decree didn't emerge in a vacuum. It reflected a growing anxiety within the Church over dissent. Heretical movements like the Cathars and Waldensians had taken root, challenging clerical authority. For the Church, torture was not just a means of confession, it was a defense against ideological rebellion. Secular rulers, too, embraced this logic. In France, England, and the German states, the legal use of torture became normalized in proceedings involving treason, sorcery, and crimes against the crown. Notably, the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, issued by Emperor Charles V in 1532, codified torture into imperial law. It included strict guidelines, such as requiring semiplena probatio or partial proof before torture could be used. But these limits were often ignored or manipulated. Once someone was accused, the system became a trap. For the accused, the process was calculated to break not just the body but the will. Before physical pain ever began, suspects were brought into interrogation rooms lined with chains, iron tools, and wooden frames. Many confessed immediately, not because of guilt but because of what they saw. And once a confession was extracted under pain, it had to be repeated without torture the next day, creating a cruel game of endurance. Public fear of these practices ran deep. Chroniclers of the time described the Inquisition's knock at the door as a death sentence. Inquisitors operated with broad discretion, often outside the reach of secular oversight. Informants could remain anonymous. Defendants were not always told what they were being accused of, and those who refused to confess risked harsher punishment or worse, being declared relapsed and burned. This system wasn't just about punishing individuals, it served a broader purpose, maintaining order. Torture was a warning, a ritualized display of power that sent a clear message: questioning authority would not be tolerated. It reinforced the idea that truth wasn't what you believed, it was what could be extracted from your body. Behind the stone walls, what unfolded wasn't just pain, it was a demonstration of who held the power to define guilt, truth, and salvation. Torture in medieval Europe was never indiscriminate. It was calculated, deployed by institutions with clear objectives: suppress dissent, extract information, and enforce conformity. But the net was wide. Heretics, accused witches, political enemies, and even common criminals could find themselves on the receiving end. Not always because they were guilty, but because they were inconvenient. Heretics were among the earliest and most frequent targets. In the 13th century, the Catholic Church launched the medieval Inquisition to root out religious nonconformity. The Cathars of Languedoc, who rejected the Church's authority and teachings, became one of the earliest large-scale examples. After military campaigns failed to wipe them out entirely, inquisitorial courts took over. Suspicion alone was enough to warrant arrest. If a person was believed to be a Cathar, sympathizer refusing to eat meat, rejecting oaths, or avoiding church sacraments, they could be detained. The Church's justification was moral. Heresy endangered not just the soul of the accused, but the collective faith of society. That logic opened the door for torture. Legal frameworks, like the papal bull Ad Extirpanda in 1252, provided official sanction. Under its terms, torture could be used against heretics, but only if their guilt was virtually certain. The standard was vague. In practice, it gave inquisitors wide discretion. They didn't need full evidence, only half-proof. A subjective category that included hearsay, rumor, or anonymous reports. Once detained, the accused could be tortured until they confessed or named others. Witch trials followed a similar pattern, but with a sharper edge of paranoia. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the belief that individuals could harness demonic powers to harm others gained traction. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487 gave the hysteria academic legitimacy. Its authors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, argued that witches posed a direct threat to Christian society and that torture was a valid means of uncovering them. Across the Holy Roman Empire, Scotland, and parts of France, the accusation of witchcraft exploded. Women were especially vulnerable. Widows, healers, midwives, anyone living on the margins could be accused. And once accused, torture became a method of validation. Under pressure, confessions multiplied, spreading fear and expanding the dragnet. Political prisoners weren't spared either. Torture served secular power just as much as religious authority. In Florence, the Medici used it against rivals. In England, the Privy Council authorized the rack for men like Edmund Campion, a Jesuit priest accused of treason in 1581. Though English common law prohibited torture, it could be bypassed through royal prerogative. Once authorized, anything was possible. Even ordinary criminals were not safe. In places like the German principalities, local courts applied the Carolina Code of 1532, which formally permitted torture under specific conditions, if there was partial evidence and the crime was severe. But partial evidence was subjective. If someone failed to provide a clear alibi, appeared nervous, or fit the stereotype of guilt, torture could be used to push for a confession. Accusations became tools. Personal grudges, local politics, and mass fear often drove who got targeted. The process gave the appearance of legal order, but the outcomes were often predetermined. Torture wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about manufacturing it by the mid-13th century. Torture had become a structured mechanism of control within the Catholic Church's most feared institution, the Inquisition. What began as a spiritual effort to defend doctrine evolved into a bureaucratic system that combined theology, law, and calibrated violence. The goal wasn't punishment, it was submission, and the process was engineered to look lawful at every stage. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX authorized the use of inquisitors, specially appointed agents of the Church tasked with identifying and rooting out heresy. These were not random mobs or rogue clergy. They were trained, methodical, and operated under papal authority. The accused were rarely told the specific charges against them. The identity of accusers was kept secret. Legal defense was almost non-existent 2 decades later. Pope Innocent IV issued Ad Extirpanda in 1252, formally permitting the use of torture. But this papal bull added a caveat: it could only be used when the evidence was virtually certain and must not endanger life or limb. These restrictions, while seemingly cautious, were full of ambiguity. Virtually certain was never clearly defined. As a result, inquisitors interpreted it liberally, and the prohibition against permanent injury was often bypassed by using techniques that inflicted unbearable pain without drawing blood or causing visible damage. The trial process followed a set pattern. First came arrest, often based on anonymous denunciations. Then came interrogation, which could last weeks or months. In theory, the accused had to consent to torture. This was the legal fiction built into the system. Judges would formally ask the prisoner if they were willing to tell the truth of their own free will. If the answer was no, or if their earlier statements were deemed insufficient, the court could authorize torture as a last resort. Records from trials show how these permissions were worded. In one 1310 case in Carcassonne, the scribe noted that the accused did not respond satisfactorily and was therefore reminded of the need to speak truly. When that didn't work, the court declared that with sorrow but necessity, torture would proceed. It was theatre legal formality masking coercion. Torture sessions were tightly scripted. They took place in the presence of clerics and notaries who recorded the exact words of the accused. Devices varied: the strappado, where a person's arms were tied behind their back and they were hoisted and dropped; the rack, which stretched the limbs; or forced sleeplessness, which wore down resistance over days. The moment a confession was given, the session stopped. But it didn't end there. The accused was then required to repeat the confession the next day, without torture for it to be valid. If they recanted, the process could begin again. These confessions were used as legal proof. Once recorded, they became the basis for sentencing. Punishments ranged from penance and property seizure to imprisonment or execution, often by burning, a punishment carried out by secular authorities under the Church's guidance. What made this system particularly insidious was its formality. Every part of the process was documented. Trials were held under the appearance of due process. Torture wasn't chaotic, was institutional, rationalized, justified by the 14th century. Inquisitorial torture had become normalized across much of Europe, particularly in regions like Aragon, Languedoc, and northern Italy. Inquisitors such as Bernard Gouy and Nicholas Amaric developed manuals that outlined step-by-step procedures. For interrogations, these texts were not hidden, they were training materials, passed between officials as part of church protocol. The Inquisition didn't invent torture, but it refined it into a clerical tool of governance. Pain was no longer just a method, was a doctrine, applied with cold precision in the service of orthodoxy. Not every device associated with medieval torture was real. Some were inventions of later centuries, exaggerated for shock or spectacle, but others were very real, used with calculated precision by inquisitors, judges, and jailers. Separating myth from fact reveals a clearer picture of how institutional violence actually functioned. The rack was real. It's one of the most historically documented torture devices in Europe. Designed to stretch the victim's body, it consisted of a wooden frame with rollers at both ends. The prisoner's wrists and ankles were tied to the rollers. As the handles turned, tension increased gradually, pulling joints from their sockets, tearing muscles, and in some cases, causing permanent damage. Its use is well documented in English history. In 1597, The Jesuit priest Robert Southwell was stretched on the rack in the Tower of London during interrogations under Queen Elizabeth. Official records confirmed its presence and application under royal orders. The strapado was another authentic method. This involved tying a person's hands behind their back, attaching the rope to a pulley, and hoisting them into the air only to drop them suddenly. The force of the fall often dislocated shoulders and caused nerve damage. It left no visible bleeding, which made it especially popular with inquisitorial courts, where torture that drew blood was technically forbidden under church law. In Florence, Savonarola, the Dominican friar who opposed corruption within the church was subjected to the strapado multiple times in 1498 before his execution. Eyewitness accounts from the time confirmed the method. Thumbscrews also existed, and they were used in both ecclesiastical and civil courts. These were simple, metal vices placed over the fingers or thumbs, tightened gradually until bones cracked. They were portable, easy to apply, and ideal for forcing a single confession or name. Thumbscrews were used throughout German-speaking territories in the 16th and 17th centuries, as attested in municipal court records and preserved devices in European museums today. Then there's the pair of angusher device, often described in lurid detail. Supposedly, it was inserted into the mouth, rectum, or vagina, then expanded via a screw mechanism. While examples of the device do exist today, historical evidence of its actual use during the medieval period is scarce. Most references appear in 18th and 19th century collections or sensationalized writings, not in medieval court records. Historians remain divided. Some believe it was real but rarely used. Others argue it's a later invention, retroactively attributed to the Middle Ages to dramatize torture narratives. The Iron Maiden is another object wrapped in myth, often depicted as a sarcophagus lined with inward-facing spikes. It's become a symbol of medieval cruelty. But there is no reliable evidence that it was ever used during the actual Middle Ages. The first known example appears in the 19th century, housed in a museum in Nuremberg. The so-called Nuremberg Virgin was likely a fabrication meant to attract visitors and provoke horror. Historians now consider the Iron Maiden more of a Victorian invention than a medieval reality. Many instruments we associate with medieval torture, like the Judas cradle or the breaking wheel, were indeed real, but their use varied by region and period. The breaking wheel, for instance, was primarily an execution tool used in France and the Holy Roman Empire. Victims were tied to a large wooden wheel and struck with a hammer or iron bar until their bones shattered. Though not always classified as torture, it served the same function: to terrorize and to send a message. Historical records, when available, show a clear preference for tools that left few marks and allowed for repeated use. Devices that drew blood or risked death too quickly were often avoided, not out of mercy, but because they ended the utility of the victim too soon. What we now call torture devices were in their time just tools of the justice system. Some were built for intimidation, some for confession, others for execution. But the mythology that surrounds the Mayan maidens dripping with blood, hidden chambers filled with infernal machinery, is more to later fascination than to the actual practices of medieval Europe. The truth is often less theatrical, but no less brutal. Torture in the medieval period wasn't always hidden in shadows. In many cases, it was staged, deliberately, publicly, and with clear intent. Torture chambers often functioned as arenas of performance, where pain became a message and confessions became scripts. The Inquisition understood this well. Though most interrogations took place behind closed doors, the outcomes were frequently paraded before the public. The goal wasn't secrecy, it was reinforcement. Confessions, extracted under pressure, were read aloud in marketplaces. Sentencing ceremonies, called Autostar F, were held in public squares. These events were highly choreographed. The condemned were dressed in penitential garments, called sanbenitos, marked with flames or symbols of their alleged crimes. Crowds gathered to watch as the church presented itself not as an enforcer, but as a divine judge, delivering salvation or condemnation in full view. Inquisitors like Bernard Gui documented the importance of spectacle. His 14th century handbook laid out not only methods of investigation, but the optics of power. When a prisoner confessed heresy and repented, the church claimed a spiritual victory. If they refused, the church handed them over to secular authorities, for execution, carefully phrased as relaxing them to the secular arm, a legal euphemism that distanced the church from direct bloodshed. Even in secular courts, torture served a symbolic function. In the German lands under the Carolina Code, the presence of town officials, legal scribes, and sometimes members of the public was deliberate. The accused knew they were being watched. The wider community understood what happened to those who resisted. The psychological impact was just as important as the physical. In Florence, after the failed Pazzi conspiracy in 1478, captured plotters were tortured and hanged publicly. The Medici didn't just punish treason, they staged a message. Resistance would be crushed, not in secret, but on display. Public readings of confessions, many of them obtained under duress, were used to validate the proceedings. The audience wasn't only the crowd, it was the entire social order. Clerics, nobles, guild leaders, merchants all were meant to see that authority could reach anyone, that truth itself could be made visible, audible, and unchallengeable. The torture chamber was more than a tool of extraction. It was a stage. And in medieval Europe, that stage served both punishment and propaganda. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, Europe entered a phase of moral panic that would claim tens of thousands of lives, most of them women, fueled by fear, theology, and political instability. The witch hunts were not just legal proceedings. They were eruptions of institutional cruelty, driven by superstition and sanctioned by courts that blurred the line between religion and justice. Torture played a central role. The turning point came in 1487 with the publication of Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, written by inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. It claimed that witchcraft was not only real, but heresy in its most dangerous form. The book detailed how to identify witches, interrogate them, and extract confessions. Though not an official church document, it quickly became the manual for witch hunters across Europe. Its recommendations included the use of torture when other means failed, a directive that courts readily embraced. Accused witches were often elderly, widowed, poor, or socially isolated. In some communities, a failed crop, a sudden illness, or a death in the village was enough to trigger suspicion. Once accused, the burden of proof was reversed. The accused had to prove their innocence, an impossible task in a system where confession, often under duress, was considered the highest form of evidence. The techniques used were designed to break resistance without necessarily spilling blood. Sleep deprivation was common. Suspects were kept awake for days, interrogated around the clock until they collapsed from exhaustion. Food and water were withheld. They were subjected to repeated, leading questions, designed not to uncover facts, but to shape a confession that matched the expectations of their interrogators. In Würzburg and Bamberg, two cities in present-day Germany, the witch trials reached industrial scale. Between 1626 and 1631, hundreds were executed in each city. Entire families were implicated. Children, under torture, named their parents. Servants accused their employers. Neighbors turned on one another. Torture didn't uncover witchcraft, created it. The confessions defied logic. Women admitted to flying on broomsticks, summoning storms, transforming into animals, or engaging in sexual acts with demons. In 1591, in Scotland, Agnes Sampson was accused of raising a storm to kill King James VI. Under torture, she confessed to summoning the devil in the form of a dog. The story was absurd, but it fit the narrative authorities needed to justify the panic. Once a confession was secured, execution followed. Burning at the stake was common in the Holy Roman Empire and France. In England, hanging was more typical. But the process interrogation, torture, forced confession, execution was nearly identical across borders. The hysteria didn't subside until the late 17th century. By then, skepticism had begun to take hold. Legal reformers questioned the reliability of confessions extracted through torture. Clergy began to challenge the theological basis of witchcraft trials. And in places like Prussia and the Dutch Republic, state authorities began to restrict or ban torture entirely. But for those decades, when fear ruled the courtroom, the witch trials revealed something chilling. With the right mix of fear, power, and legal authority, torture could manufacture belief and death on a mass scale. Torture was not confined to monasteries and inquisitorial courts. Across medieval and early modern Europe, secular rulers used it as a tool of governance, particularly in cases of treason, conspiracy, and high-stakes criminal investigations. Unlike ecclesiastical trials, where the stated goal was moral correction, secular authorities used torture to protect state power, enforce law, and neutralize dissent. In England, the legal system officially frowned upon torture. Common law did not recognize it. But that didn't stop the Crown from authorizing it through the royal prerogative. The Privy Council routinely issued warrants permitting the use of torture for cases deemed threats to national security. The most famous example came in 1605. After the failed gunpowder plot, Guy Fawkes, caught beneath the House of Lords with barrels of gunpowder, was brought to the Tower of London. There, by order of King James I, he was racked slowly stretched until he gave up the names of his co-conspirators. His confession, written in a trembling hand, remains a record of physical and mental breakdown under pressure. France developed a more formalized structure. Under the Ancien regime, judicial torture question was a recognized part of the criminal process. Two phases were permitted: la question prépatoire, to extract information, and la question préalable, to confirm a confession before execution. Branding was also used as both punishment and identification. Criminals marked with a fleur-de-lis on the shoulder were often sentenced to forced labor or exile. These procedures were carried out under court supervision and recorded by scribes, giving the illusion of legal rigor. In the Italian city-states, torture was a routine part of urban justice. Venice, Florence, and Milan all maintained state-run prisons where accused traitors and political dissidents were interrogated. The Medici in Florence used torture liberally to suppress opposition. The Pazzi conspirators, who attempted to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici in 1478, were tortured before being publicly executed. Their deaths were meant not only to eliminate rivals, but to warn others. Beyond Europe, different methods emerged. In the Middle East, bastinado, the beating of the soles of the feet, was used to extract confessions or punish thieves and tax evaders. Though it left minimal visible injury, it caused intense pain. Ottoman and Mamluk courts used it sparingly, but effectively, often in front of officials or witnesses to reinforce authority. Secular torture didn't always come wrapped in religious justification. It came in the name of order, loyalty, and sovereign control. From the dungeons of European castles to the courtrooms of imperial capitals, the logic was consistent. Pain could reveal the truth, silence those who threatened power. Torture was designed to extract the truth. But over time, it proved far better at producing what authorities wanted to hear. Modern psychological research confirms what many medieval critics suspected. Torture does not yield reliable information. Under extreme physical and mental stress, the brain prioritizes survival over accuracy. Pain, sleep deprivation, and fear do not make people honest. They make them compliant. Victims often say whatever they believe will stop the suffering. Whether it's true becomes secondary. Historian John H. Langbein, in his extensive study of judicial torture, concluded that confessions extracted this way were frequently false and legally worthless. In early modern Europe, entire cases were built on coerced statements. And yet, even when these statements were absurd claims of flying through the night, consorting with devils, or conspiring in impossible plots, they were accepted as proof. The consequences were devastating. In places like Würzburg and Bamberg, mass executions during witch hunts were fueled by these unreliable confessions. One tortured suspect could name dozens of others, triggering a chain reaction that consumed whole communities. Torture didn't solve crimes. It multiplied victims by the 18th century. Enlightenment thinkers like Cesare, Beccaria, and Voltaire began challenging its legitimacy. They argued that truth and justice could not come from fear. Slowly, legal systems began to reform. Torture was phased out not because it was inhumane, though it was, but because it didn't work. Even today, debates over coercive interrogation resurface in modern contexts. Intelligence agencies have tested similar techniques under new names, but the conclusion remains the same. Torture may produce answers, but not the truth. And when the stakes are life and death, that distinction is everything. By the mid-18th century, the age of torture was no longer unquestioned. Across Europe, the intellectual tide was turning. The Enlightenment era, grounded in reason, individual rights, and skepticism of authority, challenged the idea that pain could be a path to justice. Philosophers, legal reformers, and jurists began to dismantle the legal logic that had supported torture for centuries. One of the most influential voices was Cesare Beccaria, an Italian criminologist whose 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments argued not only against torture, but against arbitrary punishment altogether. Beccaria insisted that punishment should be proportionate, rational, and aimed at prevention, not vengeance. He called torture cruel, unreliable, and unjust, declaring, "It is confounding all relations to expect that a man should be both the accuser and the accused." His ideas resonated. In Austria, Empress Maria Theresa and her son Joseph II embraced Enlightenment principles. In 1776, Joseph formally abolished judicial torture throughout the Habsburg Empire. Prussia followed in 1740 under Frederick the Great. Sweden ended the practice in 1772. and by the early 19th century, France, Denmark, and several German states had either abolished torture outright or severely restricted its use. This legal shift did not happen in isolation. It was driven by a broader cultural transformation. The printing press spread new ideas at unprecedented speed. Public opinion, once shaped by church proclamations and royal decrees, was now influenced by books, pamphlets, and journals. The image of the state was changing. Instead of projecting dominance through fear, rulers were beginning to claim legitimacy. Through justice, reform, and stability, religious influence was also evolving. While earlier church authorities had sanctioned torture to root out heresy, many Enlightenment-era theologians began to reinterpret Christian teachings in favor of human dignity and compassion. The moral argument against torture now had both secular and spiritual weight. By the dawn of the 19th century, torture, once a cornerstone of law enforcement, had lost its legitimacy. What replaced it wasn't perfect. Prisons expanded, surveillance increased, but the public spectacle of sanctioned cruelty, once central to maintaining order, had become a symbol of tyranny. And Europe, slowly, was forced to look for other ways to define justice. Torture chambers may no longer sit beneath cathedrals or castles, but the methods and the mindset haven't vanished. In the 21st century, physical agony has been replaced by psychological pressure, legal euphemisms, and isolation. The forms have changed. The logic has not. After 9/11, U.S. intelligence agencies authorized enhanced interrogation techniques at black sites across the globe. Methods like waterboarding, sleep deprivation, sensory overload, and stress positions were deployed against detainees suspected of terrorism. Officials insisted these techniques weren't torture, but the results resembled medieval logic: confessions under pressure, secrecy justified by security, and accountability deferred in the name of a higher cause. The CIA's own 2014 Senate torture report concluded that these techniques often produced false or misleading information. Just as in the Middle Ages, pain became a way to force answers, not verify them. The distinction between intelligence gathering and coercion collapsed behind closed doors, much like it did in the torture chambers of inquisitorial Europe. Solitary confinement, now used in prison systems worldwide, also mirrors aspects of medieval punishment. Inmates held in isolation for weeks, months, or even years suffer intense psychological effects: hallucinations, depression, cognitive decline. The UN's Special Rapporteur on Torture has declared prolonged solitary confinement a form of torture. Yet in countries like the United States, tens of thousands remain in these conditions as part of routine incarceration, even in democratic societies governed by laws and oversight. The remnants of medieval control persist. Techniques once reserved for traitors and heretics now operate under new labels: national security, behavioral control, administrative segregation. The tools are cleaner, the rooms are brighter, but the goal is the same: compliance through suffering. This raises the uncomfortable question: how far have we really come? The instruments have changed, but the temptation to use pain, fear, and confinement to maintain power remains. The medieval dungeon may be gone, but its shadow still lingers. Interrogation rooms, solitary cells, and the blurred spaces between law and necessity